So let's get started with the webinar. Before you can elicit, analyze, and validate your requirements on how to build your software products, before you can plan, track, control, and execute your projects, before you can define, implement, and improve your projects, you must be able to identify your stakeholders for your products, your projects, your processes, whichever is relevant, and get them involved in the process. I love this quote from Gauss and Weinberg's book. Perhaps the most common single mistake in the development effort is leaving someone essential out of the process. I can tell you this from my own personal experience. One of the very first software projects I did right out of college, I was doing a system for an Air Force base. Spent 2 years of my life building this system. And we had a government contractor. I can talk about this system because it's so antiquated, it's long since gone, because this was back in the 70s. But the contractor actually gave us the requirements. We worked closely with them. We did all the good things you're supposed to do in a software development life cycle. We had requirements reviews with the procurement officer and customers. We did preliminary and critical design reviews. We had a 2-week acceptance test. We built prototypes. We gave them continuous feedback. We built exactly the product they wanted, and they loved it. Our customers were ecstatic. Then I went out into the field over the weekend and installed the product. Monday morning, I was supposed to start training the air traffic controllers on how to use this system. 8 o'clock in the morning came. When the class was supposed to start, nobody was there. 8:15, 8:30, nobody's there. But at 8:45, one of them finally decided to wander down. I guess he felt sorry for me. And he says, "Little lady, we don't want it. Our union is fighting it. We're never going to allow it to be installed." Now, this is 2 years of my life, so after I got out of the restroom from crying for a few minutes, I called my boss, and my boss called the customer, and the customer called the air traffic controller's boss. And by 9:30, we were all up and going, and I was training these people who did not want my system at all, the users. This is where I discovered there's a big difference between the customers of your system and the users of your system. And they all sat there reading their newspapers and things while I trained them on how to use a system they never wanted. Welcome to disaster. I mean, I know this system was never used because a year and a half later, I had been, quote unquote, maintaining it for a year and a half, and we'd had one problem report, a misspelled word on an early screen. So apparently somebody wandered in and looked at it for a couple of minutes. But I'm good, I'm not that good. There wasn't a year and a half of usage without any defects. So I made that single most common mistake. I forgot one of my main stakeholders, the users. I did not get them actively involved in the requirements design and development process, and the system was a complete disaster. So the benefits of identifying your stakeholders as you're going through this, first of all, it helps you prevent those requirements from being missed. I can tell another example, early in my career example. I've learned a lot. Hopefully this will help you not make some of the same mistakes. But this was an energy and management and building automation system. And it was this particular company got a single energy bill, and then they were going to slice and dice it by tenant in their building. And they had requested that we build an add-on and paid us a bunch of money to build this custom add-on that's a billing system. And I, again, did quote-unquote everything right, got it out in the field, and I'm installing it over the weekend. Minneapolis, Minnesota, January, 12 inches of snow. So once I finished installing it, which went really easily and really quickly, I volunteered to enter his database for him. I knew he was a one-finger typist. Started entering the database, and we got down, everything worked great till we hit the American Red Cross. Now think a minute, what's special about the American Red Cross and a billing system? Well, they're a charity, and therefore they're sales tax exempt. And the customer looked over my shoulder and pointed at the screen and says, where's the field to make the American Red Cross sales tax exempt? And I said, young and naive that I was, you never told me that was a requirement. Well, duh. It had always been a requirement, but by forgetting about the American Red Cross as one of the potential users of this system, one of the potential stakeholders, I'd forgotten that requirement. And so had the customer. But whose responsibility is it really to build them a good system? Having all your stakeholders identified helps provide additional experience and knowledge of the domain. I am never going to know everything there is to know about my customer's business that I'm writing software for. The more stakeholders I talk to, the more people I identify and get involved, they're going to tell me about things that I might not know otherwise. And that may lead to additional critical requirements. It helps obtain different perspectives and helps manage the conflicts between your stakeholders. One of the things I love about holding joint application development sessions or requirements facilitation meetings is getting everybody involved and getting those different perspectives, which may bring those conflicts, like I want it done this way and some other user wants it done a conflicting or different way, and helps bring those together and resolve those. You may not notice them if you talk to each stakeholder individually. Identifying your stakeholders also gives you a whole lot more buy-in. I'll use the process definition example here rather than the requirements one. When I was defining processes, the more stakeholders you get involved, the more they have input into the process. It helps create ownership and buy-in into that defined process, even if all they did was peer review it and give their comments on it. And once, all new systems, be they new processes, new products, whatever, create change. And the more buy-in into that change you can get because they've had a say, that can help you. In fact, many times these stakeholders are the people that are going to help sell the system back into the user community, back into the stakeholder community for you, so you don't have to do as much marketing. It also helps you manage your stakeholder expectations over time. People change their mind, new stakeholders come and go. I've had projects where the manager of the customers group changed, and if I wasn't well aware and continuing to manage that stakeholder, I might not have noticed this and the fact that the old guy had different ideas than the new manager did. And all in all, the end result is if they're involved, if their requirements are met, if you give them what they need and want, you're going to increase your stakeholder satisfaction. So there's lots of reasons to identify and involve your key relevant stakeholders in the decision processes for your projects, your products, and your processes. Now, I like to bring in a couple examples just to say this isn't Linda's idea. This is good industry standard practice. For example, if you look at the capability maturity model for development, one of the generic practices that apply to every single process, be it requirements engineering, risk management, configuration management, whatever, for each process you need to identify and involve the relevant stakeholders. The purpose here is to establish and maintain the expected involvement of those relevant stakeholders throughout the execution of that particular process. In order to do that, you've got to identify the stakeholders. If you don't know about them, you can't involve them, you can't manage their expectations. So you've got to decide who your stakeholders are and then who those key relevant ones. One of the things you'll find is there are literally a huge number of stakeholders on some products or projects and things. So you've got to make conscious decisions to bring that down to the relevant few that you can deal with and manage. Can't forget about the other ones, but you need to do that. Share that with all the project people, the people that are doing the planning. Make sure that the requirements analysts, the designers, the project managers, everyone is aware of that stakeholder list, who you've decided are your key stakeholders, and make sure they're being involved. The PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide, the 5th edition that just came out. Prior to that, identifying and managing your stakeholders were just sub-processes under communications. But the Project Management Institute now realizes that identifying your stakeholders are so important that it has now become a process area in and of itself. They've added a 13th process area to the PMBOK, which is managing your stakeholders with 4 major sub-processes: identifying your stakeholders, putting a stakeholder management plan together, and making conscious decisions on who to involve, how to involve them, when to involve them, managing your stakeholders throughout the life cycle, and controlling any issues that come up with your stakeholders. So these two, among others, have identified that stakeholders are very important. In fact, the new 2015 edition of the ISO 9001 standard is emphasizing stakeholders and stakeholder involvement as well. So how do you do all of this? Let's get into the meat of this webinar. The first step is you've got to identify them. Like anything else, if you don't know about it, you can't manage it, you can't deal with it. So you've got to identify who your stakeholders are. So who's a stakeholder? A stakeholder is any individual or individual person, any group of people, any organization who can either influence or is influenced by the decisions, the activities, the outcomes of either your product, your process, your project, depending on which one you're focusing on. So this is anybody that can influence it or be influenced by. Well, obviously that gets rather broad. So let's look at kind of my high-level checklist for this. When we think product stakeholders, the first ones that usually come to mind, hopefully, are our acquirers and users, both the users and the customers. I like to make a distinction here because of, again, the early experience, the story I told you with the air traffic control system. Customers are the people that pay the bills. Users are the people that actually lay hands on your system or use the information out of your system. And there can be a difference here. Now, when it comes to, for example, a Microsoft product, I bought Microsoft Office, I use Microsoft Office. The same person is both your users and your customers. But many times that's not true. The people paying the bills are not the same people as the people using your system. The people selecting the system. For example, when I worked for a company, the IT organization was the customer and they selected Microsoft Office and installed it, even though I was a user there. When I think users, I like to break that down into various subgroups. The major ones are direct users. Direct users are the people who actually lay hands on the keyboard and use your system. Those are the ones, again, that we think of off the top of our head. But we need to drill down from that and think about indirect users. Indirect users are the people that use the information that come out of our system. For example, I like to use the pay at the gas pump system as one of my examples in a lot of my classes. We've all done it, but there's some real meat there. Direct users would be the people buying gas, from the gas station that are punching the buttons out on the pump, the attendant, the owner of the gas station who's running the nightly reports, all those kinds of people. Indirect users that may be using information out of that system, maybe there's some special reports that need to go to corporate headquarters because corporate headquarters is an indirect user. Another indirect user might be the accountant of the system who is running the monthly sales tax reports out of information that comes out of the system. Or even the sales tax department itself of the government who's collecting those taxes based on information that comes out of the system. All of those might be examples of indirect users. Now I have one more box there, what I call unfriendly users. These are people that are going to try to use your system that you don't want to use your system, people you want your system to be unfriendly to. For example, with users, this may include people like credit card thieves that are trying to use someone else's credit card to break in and buy gas with your system. Hackers that are trying to come in and steal information out of your system. People with expired credit cards or credit cards that are already over the limit. In fact, we talk a lot about use cases in software. If you've ever dealt with use cases, I'm seeing more and more for these unfriendly users putting together what are called misuse cases so that we have and think about our security and our safety and our other issues and bring those into requirements. If we don't think about the credit card counterfeiter, we might not have the appropriate safeguards built into our system. On the other hand, we need to remember that we ourselves are stakeholders in our system, and there can be lots of us on the supplier side. Obviously, the project manager has different goals and requirements than the developers or the testers. There may be subcontractors. There may be supporting organizations or specialists like QA or CM or even the legal department. There might be a supporter. People that are going to maintain the software. Even your help desk people are going to be potential stakeholders in your project. If you've ever noticed in Microsoft Word, there's always a way, or any of the Microsoft projects, a way of going in to find out what version, revision, and service pack you've got on there. That's actually a requirement that I believe comes from the help desk people. So that when Joe Schmo calls in from the field who doesn't know what he's doing, someone like my father-in-law, who barely is computer literate, the help desk person can at least find what version and revision and service pack by walking him through some simple commands, because he was not going to know. Even the distributors of your system. When I did energy management and building automation, we did not sell directly to the people, the customers and users. We sold to the contractors who were building the building, and they distributed the system as they were building the building. So there's lots of different stakeholders here. This is just, as I mentioned, a very high-level checklist. I did not feel that I wanted to waste your time going through a bunch of different checklists, but one of the things that Louise will be doing is posting a set of these PowerPoint slides out on the web, and at the end of this presentation I've added a few more slides that I'm not actually going to talk about, but it's a couple more checklists for thinking about your different kinds of stakeholders. For example, even direct users, they might break down into novice users, people with special needs like handicapped. I built a system once that for energy management building automation worked great. Each page was the floor of the building, and everything was green on the floor. And if anything went into alarm, it went red. Worked great until we met our first colorblind user who couldn't tell the difference. And then we had to go to red flashing so that they could see something had gone into alarm. So think about all these different kinds of even direct users. So I've got a checklist out there to help you think through some of that. We just won't talk about it specifically during the webinar. And of course, there may be other users. For those of you in a government-regulated industry, the regulators aren't acquirers, they aren't suppliers, but they sure are stakeholders that you need to be paying attention to. My example for the pay at the gas pump here would be the firemen. You know, they are not going to buy gas from you necessarily, but they have a vested interest in the main requirement they have is that emergency all stop button. So if anything happens and there's a fire, you can turn off all the gas pumps and stop putting fumes into the air that'll help spread the fire. Whatever's appropriate here. That's product stakeholders. Project stakeholders, of course, include all of the stakeholders of the product that's being created by this project. But in addition to that, people that are funding, initiating, or championing the project manager, members of the project management team, other people that are supporting the project. I mentioned the lawyers, maybe the marketing people, things like that are vested interest in the project. People from other projects or programs that must interface or coordinate with yours. For example, if my project is running late, I'm not releasing my testers on time to some other project that's expecting them to start testing, and therefore the second project is being impacted by my project. People up in the project management office. You'll start building your own checklists for these kinds of things. But if I'm doing project planning, the worst thing a project manager can do is go build a work breakdown structure on their own without getting relevant stakeholders involved, because they forget or don't even know about all the things a tester does, for example. I've seen work breakdown structures that say we're going to go execute the test cases, but they leave no time for planning the test cases, for automating the test cases, for doing requirements analysis, for writing the test report, and all of a sudden testing is way, way, way behind schedule. Not because the testers aren't doing their job, but because all the things involved in their job have not been considered and given time on the work breakdown structure. So one of the best ways of ensuring you get good estimates is making sure you've considered all the work by involving these stakeholders and making sure you understand what that work is. Process stakeholders, again, include the stakeholders of the product being produced by the process. Of course, if I'm doing the requirements process, the direct stakeholders of that requirements product are my designers who are going to design to it, my testers who are going to test to it, my customers that are using it to understand what they are building. One of the ways I love to involve the products of the stakeholder in the process is make sure that they're involved in the peer review. Who better to peer review a requirements document than the developers who are going to have to understand it anyway and make sure they interpret it correctly? You get a double bang for the buck. They get to ask questions, they get to understand the requirements better. At the same time, they're peer reviewing it and finding defects. Same with the testers. And of course, if you can get a customer representative in there, they'll tell you whether that's what they really wanted. People directly involved in planning, managing, and executing, tracking, and controlling that process. The people that are actually actively involved in the process. One of the mistakes I did, again, early on, like I said, I've made them all during my career. I've made most of the mistakes. I'm trying to help you not repeat my errors. I came in, I thought I was hired to help define the processes for a telecom company. Brand new, first time I'd done this. Went out to the industry, all the industry standards, all the industry good practices. I wrote the best system testing process document you'd ever want to see. Of course, it had nothing to do with how they really did business. You know, your process, you've got to get your stakeholders involved, the people actually doing the work, so they understand how the work is really being done. process definitions should always match the way the work is really being done. Of course, again, you yourself, if you're defining the processes, if you're documenting the process, you're a stakeholder in them. The management people championing the process, the people funding the process activities, and of course, the stakeholders of other processes that interface with your process. So those are my checklists for helping identify stakeholders. Lots of different techniques for identifying your stakeholders. One of the ones I love is have a collaborative workshop. Early on, I identify a few key stakeholders. For example, pay at the gas pump again. I'll get somebody to represent the owners, somebody to represent the attendants, somebody to represent the customer groups, whatever. Bring them together, some of my key stakeholders, and have them help me identify all the other stakeholders. Again, they know more about their business than you ever will. And by having some kind of collaborative workshop here where they brainstorm or they brainwrite and then identify and decide what to do about these stakeholders, can get you a much more complete list than you would get yourself. You can interview other stakeholders. Every time I do a requirements interview or a process interview, I always ask the question, who else should I talk to? Who else knows things about this that I should be aware of? That can help me identify additional stakeholders. And of course, lessons learned, folks. Every time I forget a stakeholder, I put them on my checklist so next time I don't forget them. So those checklists are always my last sanity check to go through and say, have I missed anybody? Have I thought about all the people that I need to include? Now, like I said, I gave you some examples at the end of this webinar that will be in the posting. Take those checklists, file the serial numbers off of them. If there's stakeholders on those lists that don't apply to you, take them off. If there are other stakeholders, continuously add them. And adopt and adapt those standard checklists to something that's going to work and be useful to you. So that's step one. You got to know who they are. But like I said, many times this ends up being an extremely long list. When I teach my class on requirements engineering and we brainstorm all the product stakeholders for the pay at the gas pump, most groups come up with 40 or 50 stakeholders when they start getting down. Even the Slurpee salesman that's selling Slurpee syrup to the gas station is a stakeholder, because if you're buying stuff outside, you're not coming in and buying things from them. So they are being influenced by your system. But those are probably not a stakeholder that you want actively involved in the requirements engineering process. So once you've got this stakeholder list, there's never time to include all the potential stakeholders. You've got to prune this down to who are those key stakeholders you want involved. Now, one of the first passes I tend to do is just must include, like to include, and ignore. Now, must include, again, I must actively include this stakeholder in this project, or in this product, or in this process, depending on which I'm looking at. So these are the people that are going to be my active stakeholders that I'm going to involve, those relevant stakeholders. Now, if I have time, you know, if things go well and risks don't turn into problems, I may have a little more time, and my like to includes, I'll prioritize and include them from top down of that priority list as I can, as time and schedule and costs allow. Some of them will be included, some of them may not be. Of course, if things go badly, the only people I'm going to involve is those must includes, if I run out of time. And finally, the ignores. These are the ones, like the Slurpee salesman, that I'm never going to get to. They're at the bottom of the list. I'm intentionally ignoring them. Now, notice the asterisk, folks. Ignoring them means ignoring their active participation. It does not mean ignoring their needs and requirements. So if you have, for example, that Slurpee salesman, and you're going to ignore them, you've got to figure out, yeah, I'm not going to actively involve them in, for example, the requirement solicitation, but how can I make sure that their needs and motivations are considered? Well, one way to do it is to take one of your relevant stakeholders, like the owner of the business, and when you interview them, you have questions on your interview about how do you want to deal with the potential loss of sales in your store if everybody's buying gas out at the pump. You may have to get creative. For example, you can put advertising out at the pump, or you can put coupons on the back of the receipt, or whatever is appropriate to deal with that requirements. But you've got to still get their requirements, their needs. You can't forget them. You just aren't actively involving that group or individual, that stakeholder, in the process. Again, I tend to keep my stakeholder as a generic name. For example, this will be an attendant, and in fact, hold that thought, because when I get to step 3, we're going to talk a little bit about that kind of concept. But again, if you keep them as more generic roles, if the person changes, then you change your stakeholder participation plan to include the new person rather than the old person. But I try and remember them as generic roles. This is going to be the attendant, this is going to be the owner, this is going to be the customer that buys gas from me. I might have different customers. There may be a family car driver stakeholder versus an 18-wheeler driver stakeholder, because the needs are different. And then the stakeholder plan includes who's going to represent them, and that may change over time. So that's how I typically handle that. But again, it's like anything else. Change is inevitable. It's like any other plan. You're going to have to adjust the plan as changes happen. Now, this first one is my first pass. My must includes, my like to includes, my ignores. I always like to do things as simply as possible and no more. So if this gives me what I need to prune my stakeholder list, I'm happy. But I've seen it where we've gone through and my must include list still includes 20 or 30 stakeholders. They just all seem really important. What do I do? Well, you can always go to a more rigorous prioritization. I don't have time to talk to all 20. They all seem important to me. How do I start prioritizing them? Or if I'm looking at some of my must includes and I have some extra time, how do I prioritize those? Well, one of the things you can do is actually use a prioritization matrix. The things that I think are good considerations, and this comes out of the PMBOK, are to think about that person or that stakeholder group's power and authority. You know, this is the senior manager, I'm going to give them a 5. You know, this is the president of the company. They've got a lot of power and authority. They're going to get a 5 versus this is just an individual contributor. Maybe they get a 1. How interested are they in the project? You may have somebody with a lot of power but next to no interest. You know, they're not going to be as important a stakeholder as maybe someone with less power but a lot more interest, someone who's going to actively come to your meetings and actively participate. You want to find somebody from a stakeholder group that's going to provide you with the information that you actually need. You also, how influential are they? Remember, these are people that can influence or be influenced by your product. Well, how much influence do they have? You may have a key person who has little to no authority but is extremely influential. For example, someone who's writing a review blog on products of your type, or somebody that could potentially influence a lot of other people. I worked for a company once where I think I was that. I was an individual contributor, but simply by power of will, maybe is a good way of saying it. I tended to be a strong influencer of other people. Their impact, their ability to actually change things. All of those would be considerations. You can put weights on those if you want to. If you want to consider them all equal, you can eliminate this line. And then you score each stakeholder on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, whatever appropriate to you. I used a scale of 1 to 5 here. For example, this first stakeholder has very little power. Maybe they're an individual contributor, but a significant amount of interest. They're not a 5. They're about average there. I'm sorry, interest in your project. No influence at all, but minimal influence, but they've got an ability to impact your project, a fairly significant ability. You just multiply the weight times the score and add across. And it's not really what the score is over here, but the relativeness of this score. For example, stakeholder 2 would have the highest priority because they have the highest weighted score. Stakeholder 1 would have the second highest, and so on. So something like this, if you can't just through an easy rule of thumb, these are more important than those, some kind of ranking. If you need to be more rigorous than that, this kind of table may help you prune your stakeholder list. Then the third step here is to actually plan their active participation in the project. I told you I'd get to step 3. And this is who's going to represent that particular stakeholder group. Is there going to be an individual representative? The Agilists do this. For all their stakeholders, they have a single representative, the product owner. And all of the other stakeholders bring their concerns, their requirements, their needs to that product owner. And they act as that single representative for all of the customers and users. You may have George, who's owned gas stations for the last 30 years, and he owns 20 of them, and he knows intimately the ins and outs of running a gas station. So he's going to be selected as your representative for all your gas stations. You may want to go out and sample multiple people from that stakeholder group. Through surveys, you can actually interview multiple people, you can bring them together in a focus group, something like that. One of the things when I was defining processes, we'd actually have a process technical committee. For each of our processes, we would sample some people from each of our stakeholder groups and bring them together into a committee that actually acted almost as a change control board for our processes. If your stakeholder group is small enough, you can even have an exhaustive, you talk to them all. I've had projects where I have a single customer. That's the person with the purse strings, and that's the person I listen to. I've, in effect, exhaustively handled that group. But if your group is large, you may have to go to representatives or samples. When are you going to talk to or involve this particular stakeholder? For example, if you're doing process definition and you've got a process stakeholder, you might just involve them in the information gathering. Go out and interview them about the process, what they do, and then bring that information in and write the process. You may have other stakeholders that you want actively helping you write the process documentation. I do that many times. I bring the process owner group together, and using an LCD projector, we define the process. I'm running the keyboard, but as a team, we have, in effect, a facilitated workshop where we're defining the details of the process. And they're sitting there telling me, no, Linda, there's a step in between that. And we have to actively do that. You may have others that just review the processes and give you comments back after you've written them. There may be people who are contributing change requests against your process once they're implemented and involved. So there's maybe stakeholder groups that are simply going to be involved in the execution of the process. You may have other stakeholder groups that are only involved in the approval of the processes. Whatever is appropriate here. So for each of your stakeholder groups, once you've identified them, once you've got your key stakeholders, who's going to represent that group? So when are we going to involve those people in what we're working on? How are we going to involve them? Are they going to participate on the team, only in specific activities? Are they just subject matter experts that you're going to go ask questions to if you need them? So they only get involved on an as-needed basis. Are they going to be actively involved in reviewing, for example, the documentation or evaluating prototypes, mock-ups, that kind of thing? How are you going to actively involve each of these stakeholders, and what's their priority? Notice, again, I'm going back to priorities, because if there's conflicts, who are you going to listen to? And again, it's not if, it's when. There's always going to be differences of opinions on what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And when those conflicts arise, having a plan, including priorities of your stakeholders on who to listen to and how to deal with it. I'll talk more about priorities here in a minute. So this is my a very basic stakeholder participation plan. I'm going back to the pay at the gas pump now, and this is my plan for involving some of my key stakeholders in requirements development. So as I am planning, of course you could actually say this is part of project planning as well as part of requirements engineering, the product stakeholders, because everything that goes on this participation plan has to be accounted for with time and budget and tasks in your project plans as well. So for example, I've got the owner of the gas station, and I've decided the who is that owner champion, like I said, George, who's owned 30 gas stations for 30 years. And he's actually going to be on the requirements team and participate in the facilitated requirements workshops. On the other hand, just to make sure I don't miss anything, during requirements elicitation, I'm going to go do a sample of other stakeholders and bring them into a focus group and show them a mock-up of the owner's user interface to make sure they like it. The owners are going to have high priority. Now, 18-wheeler drivers have different needs than family car drivers. If you've ever gone around back there where they pump, for example, there's two pumps because they have the huge tanks and they want to pump into both tanks at the same time. So you have a single gas pump and a shadow gas pump, but it only ends up being one transaction. So they're going to have different requirements. Maybe we pick a union representative. During the elicitation process, we're going to go interview them. Now maybe we can make that them a lower priority. They're still a key stakeholder, but they've got a lower priority because we're going to have a lot less truck stops than we are family gas stations in town, whatever. Of course, don't forget your unfriendly stakeholders, somebody like a counterfeiter. Now you're not going to be able to go out and interview counterfeiters, but maybe you have an internal security consultant, or you can hire somebody that knows something about security and get that subject matter expert. And they're going to be on call as you need them. During elicitation, you want to interview them and get all your security requirements from them. During analysis, you want them to help you define the security requirements. And during validation, they're going to peer review, but not everything, just the security requirements. And again, maybe these people are medium because you want to make sure that you don't lose a lot of money to the counterfeiters. Now this is by no ways a complete list, it's just an example. And remember, sometimes the who is not even a person. Someone like the sales tax collector from the government, you're not going to be able to go interview a government person. They're not going to make themselves available to your project. So you may have to go to the documentation. Regulators may be like that. You may go to the documentation and say, what does the regulation say? Or you may have some kind of regulatory expert from your company that acts as a subject matter expert. So for whatever, you're going to put a plan together of what are those key stakeholders, who are you going to have to represent that stakeholder. for this particular activity, this one happens to be requirements development, but it could be process definition, it could be project work breakdown structure creation or project execution. Whatever it is, how are you going to involve that stakeholder? For example, during project execution, you may have a key stakeholder who's one of your suppliers. And how who's going to represent that supplier? Well, who's your supplier liaison? When are you going to involve them? Well, maybe you're going to audit them a couple of times. Maybe you're going to have key phase gate reviews where you all get together in a meeting. Maybe you're going to have supplier/acquirer status meetings periodically. When are you going to involve them? How are you going to involve them? And of course, what's their priority? So these stakeholder plans are going to be very specific to, is this project stakeholders, product stakeholders, process stakeholders? What is it you're trying to do? But you need to be developing these plans. Now, whether you formally document them or not is up to you, but you still got to be making these decisions and thinking about them. I'm not an advocate for documentation heavy. A lot of times I make these decisions and don't even bother to write them down. But they're decisions that have to be made. You have to consciously think about so that you're not missing people, so that you know who and when and how you want to involve each of these people or each of these stakeholder groups in your project. Now, stakeholders don't agree with each other. This is what's going to happen, folks. You've got one customer who wants one thing. You've got another customer who wants something else. For example, one of the ones I like is, I hate mice. Literally the computer mouse, I don't have one. I use that little thumb thing in the middle of my PC. In fact, I went out and bought for my home computer, $350 it cost me, a full keyboard that has that little, I call it the rubber eraser mouse dot in the middle that you just use with one finger. I think part of it's that I am left-handed, and back in the day, you only could buy right-handed mice. I don't like to use mice. Whenever possible, I use hotkeys. If you take my hands off the keyboard and make me go to the mouse, you just slowed me down. So I want Control-S for save and Control-C for copy and all of those kinds of things. On the other hand, my husband is a mouse person. In fact, every time he works on my computer, he has to go find a mouse and come plug it in. Sometimes you can get away with adopting the software to handle both. Microsoft does this. There's hotkeys for everything and icons for everything. In fact, there's also pull-down menus for people like my father, who uses Microsoft so rarely he needs those real English words to be able to pull something down and say, aha, there's where that save command is hiding from me. So if your users have conflicts and you're lucky enough to be able to accommodate the different styles through options or customization of your software, all fine and good. But if you can't, then the key here is that you have some kind of criteria or mechanism to resolve those conflicts. Who are you going to listen to when all else fails? Again, I don't necessarily advocate you write this down, but you should have some kind of plan on who you're going to listen to. For example, if you have different people within a stakeholder group, maybe this is the owners of the gas station, and you pull them into a focus group, and there's a lot of division of what they believe the owner interface ought to look like. Who are you going to listen to? Well, if you've got that single representative, maybe they make the decision. Or you can prioritize the stakeholders within that group. You don't have to just prioritize your stakeholder group. You can prioritize individuals within that group. For example, when I worked for telecommunications, we had a lot of different customers who were buying our systems from us. Now, our ultimate stakeholder representative was the marketing VP. So sometimes we could go to him and make decisions. Other times we prioritize the customers within that group, and one of the criteria we used was how much they bought from us recently. If they're buying millions of dollars worth of systems from us every year, they're going to be listened to a lot more than this customer over here that buys one system every 5 years. So again, based on business objectives, based on whatever appropriate criteria, you can prioritize within the group. Now, the ultimate is the customer decides. Excuse me. And in the Agile world, that's that product owner. For other things, for example, the owner of the gas station is buying the pay at the gas pump product from us. So I would go to them to resolve conflicts between what different attendants want or what different customers who are buying gas from us may want. So ultimately, what's the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. Ultimately, let the person buying the system, of course that assumes that there is a single person there or a single representative from that group. If you have various stakeholder groups that don't agree with each other, for example, the attendants want something different than the owners want something different than the customers, whatever, one of the things I like to do early on, many times you're going to have some kind of decision-making team anyway for your products, your projects, your processes. For example, for my product, I'm going to have a change control board for that product over time. They're going to make decisions about what comes in from the field as enhancements, what are the priorities of fixing problems, all of those kinds of things. They're going to make those decisions anyway. Why not put that body together early, even in the requirements phase, and have them make those decisions? The other example that I've already talked about is that process owner group, the people that are different stakeholders that are working on that process, or the key ones, form a team to help make decisions about that process and bring them together early. If there's conflicts, take it to that team. Let that team hash it out and make decisions. That's what they're there for. Again, you can prioritize. That's going back to this priorities here that we talked about. The owners are going to be listened to over the 18-wheeler drivers if the different stakeholder groups have different priorities. And again, finally, the ultimate decision maker is that customer representative. And you may have conflicts between what the external stakeholder groups want, the customers and users, versus what development wants. Again, you make decisions about how to deal with these various stakeholder groups. So that is the end of the webinar. Thank you very much.